Hi, this is the worst kept secret around, Andrew, and this is Gayties Toys. So, on previous MIA 80s Ladies, we've covered Kenner's superpowers, and it's high time we tackled Mattel's Secret Wars at the same time. This is going to be, likewise, a bit of a longer series. There's going to be a few entries, but unlike superpowers, where they at least had one female figure, Secret Wars did not, so we don't know what the look or the construction or proportions of them would be. That said, at least, we have a very finite story, a very, 12-issue miniseries with a finite amount of, women in that series. So this will be a lot more, easy to create versus, on the DC side where it's everybody. The first two we're going to tackle, actually, are the ones who, to the best of my knowledge, weren't even in the Secret Wars comic, but were at the very least planned for the canceled Wave 4 of the Secret Wars toy line, and that being Dazzler and Mystique. The Secret Wars toy line ran from 1984 to 1985 and had, let's say, 2.5 waves. It was actually Mattel's, response to Kenner's superpowers. So they were the ones who went to Marvel and said, we'd like not only to make action figures of your brands, but also if you could produce a comic book series to coincide with this. Marvel was perfectly fine with this because they were likewise advertising G.I. Joe as comics before the cartoon aired, so they were no stranger to this at all. The Secret Wars comics ran for a full 12 issues. It was really considered to be comic book's first real event where there was, tie-ins with other books and some pretty seismic things that happened in it. The story was really about some cosmic being called the Beyonder who wore this incredibly snazzy suit, who took a real interest in the heroes and villains of Marvel and plucked groups of them onto Battle World, where essentially he, and by he I mean the writers, kind of smashed all their action figures together. I don't know if Mattel had much say in character selection. I would suspect possibly. They certainly had some say in what they wanted to see, though. They wanted playsets, they wanted vehicles, they wanted toyetic things, and these were kind of, I would say, clumsily kind of dropped in throughout the whole series. A lot has been said about the Secret Wars toys over the years. I mean, they sort of don't have the legacy that Kenner's Superpowers does. That said, I mean, some people are really kind of coming around to them, and, they're quite charming, unique styling at the time. One of the big complaints, however, is that any character with a cape didn't have one, and likewise, they all came with these really ridiculous, clunky shields that you would put in lenticular pictures into them, almost like picture frames, that would move and sort of give you a bit of an idea of who the character was, what their powers could do. The villains had square ones, the heroes had circle ones, and likewise, Captain America didn't come with his own shield, so strange choices. And speaking of strange choices, the character selections largely were pretty good. A great assortment of heroes, villains, whatnot, a few oddballs here and there, but when it came time to actually make women characters for Wave 4, they chose two characters that weren't really in the book. Dazzler, I would say, had a bit of a tie-in, and I admittedly haven't read all of the tie-ins, but I just cannot find Mystique in there for whatever reason. Nevertheless, they were indeed planned for Wave 4. Dazzler herself has a very interesting history. She first debuted in comics in Uncanny X-Men number 130, which also introduced Kitty Pryde and the Hellfire Club. This was all very early in the Phoenix Saga, and we didn't know it at the time, but it was a seismic issue. Likewise, Marvel had paired with Casablanca Records, and they tried to almost create something out of nothing. I mean, they wanted Dazzler to be in comics, but also to have an album, and maybe either a live-action TV special or a movie. She went through a lot of different tie-in multimedia proposals that all kind of fell apart. Nevertheless, Marvel was very much still in the Dazzler game, so she got her own miniseries, her own solo series, that continued on for many years afterwards, until finally really shacking up with the X-Men and really being firmly in that camp. Of the two, you probably know Mystique a little more. She first debuted in Miss Marvel, aka Carol Danvers, number 16 in 1978, just a few years before Dazzler. She likewise would sort of, go and become an X-Men villain, and also a bit of an X-Man anti-hero herself. I mean, she was a terrorist. She led an iteration of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. She led Freedom Force. I mean, she's really kind of like been X-Men orbiting around. I mean, she's a very interesting character, and what's probably most interesting, what a lot of people really know about her, is that while she was theorized to be Nightcrawler's mom, turns out she was actually the father. The mother was Destiny. This is more of a recent development, and we'll see if it's retconned away, but interesting nevertheless. Likewise, she was foster mother to another X-Man, Rogue, and she was the one who really kind of propelled her to go attack not only Dazzler, but Miss Marvel and drain her powers, which is why Rogue is such a brick shithouse to this day. All of this is to say that the reason for their inclusion in this toy line might be linked to who they were at that time. I mean, Marvel was very much, at least in deals, of trying to make Dazzler bigger than she became. So for them, either Marvel to push her or Mattel to sort of glom onto it, I'm not sure what happened, but she was absolutely planned. We've never seen prototypes, designs of the figures, but she was probably of the two more in development. She had quite a number of those lenticular shield art pieces that were designed by Bruce Timm of Batman the Animated Series fame, no less. Likewise, Mystique was the new hotness. I mean, there were 3 women villains in Secret Wars. 2 of them actually created specifically for Secret Wars, and we'll get to them someday. But as for a toy, as for colors that pop on a shelf, I mean, you can't do worse than Mystique. So while they might not be, terribly Secret Warsy in terms of the comic book, they made for great figures and for great, cross-promotion materials in the case of Dazzler. Often, when women aren't included in toy lines, I cry foul and sexism. But there's a bit of that considering they weren't in earlier, but also, I mean, the toy line was a failure from the start. I mean, it never really took off like Masters of the Universe, like Superpowers. It had a slow death. It took place over 2 years, so much so that the final 3rd wave was just a handful of figures, and they were made in such small quantities that they weren't, readily available enough for the US market. So they were just shipped off overseas, and they are amongst the rarest and most expensive figures to get. That said, we never got the last wave, which really would have been great. They had a lot of great, big iconic Marvel characters there, but alas, 2 women in 1 wave. Did not happen. So, what's happened since? A lot. Secret Wars was, probably more than just a toy commercial. I mean, it really introduced the idea of events to comic books, and, for good or ill, that became the standard going forward, and would result in great things like Crisis on Infinite Earths, and a lot of the trash we see today. Likewise, this would be the first appearance of the Julia Carpenter Spider-Woman. Again, we'll get back to her. And probably most famously, the black suit Spider-Man infamously wore throughout the 80s, and periodically on and off since. For figures of Mystique and Dazzler specifically, there's tons. There's no shortage. Toy Biz would do 1 of each back in the 90s. Likewise, Marvel Legends has quite a few, so they're fine. If you want a figure of these 2 characters, you've got options. As for Secret Wars itself, recently, time of recording, at the 2024 Hasbro PulseCon, the Hasbro team did reveal retro-style packaging in the Secret Wars style. They included quite a number of the big dog characters from that, including Titania, who was a villainess created for Secret Wars and never really got a figure from Hasbro. So it was a great inclusion. I'm not mad that, Dazzler and Mystique were not there, but it did tip me off in a few other things. The fan response to this was surprising. Granted, this PulseCon in particular was a little lackluster, but fans really, really enjoyed the Secret Wars packaging, and it's a little surprising that Hasbro isn't really taking this feedback and doing what Hasbro do, and that's, reissue and create retro lines. They've been doing this with the retro collection with Star Wars. They've been doing it with Ghostbusters re-releases. They do it with Transformers and in multiple different ways. So while they did try a 3 3/4 inch Kenner-ish Marvel line some years ago, it wouldn't be a bad idea just to go whole hog in and just, kind of recreate a retro Secret Wars lines, and including the women characters. I don't know if this is going to happen. I don't know if this is on the radar. I don't know if they have the bandwidth to actually do this. But this one piece of cardboard with a figure slapped on top really ginned up some interest in a line that, by and large, was no superpowers. As proof of concept, Toy Otter, infamous for creating, lost waves and, concept figures on Instagram and Facebook, did post an image of what he thought Wave 4 would be, including Dazzler and Mystique, and this would be the first time we saw women in this form factor. It's really, like a lot of his work, something you point to and say, I want that. I don't know Mattel's rights in this. I don't know their, legal ownership of these molds, of these kinds of figures. That's a little vague, but nevertheless, I mean, it would be, a fun thing. And if y'all have been watching my videos for any amount of time, I'm all about that retro stuff, and I'm all about, bringing new characters into old lines. So some to consider Hasbro, but, time of recording, nothing to report here. But if you love Secret Wars, if you like these characters, you've got options. Don't worry about it. And that's it for today's MIA 80s Ladies on these two ladies of Secret Wars. We'll be back for a few more, don't worry about it. And I thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like it, comment, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time on MIA 80s Ladies.